This lesson is going to be an introduction to simple NParticle systems in Maya. Just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, this is using the dynamic systems in Maya, similar to using NCloth, but we're going to create particles. You can create rain, snow, leaves falling. You could use actual objects as your particles or some of the built-in objects. There's a big variety, okay? So I've got the workspace for classic Maya and I've got my effects menu up. But just to show you what we're talking about, I'm going to back this up and go ahead and play it. So this is creating some dynamic spheres with a little kind of surface collider. They're bouncing into each other, self-colliding, and then falling off the surface of the table. That's just one type of NParticle system out there. So we'll get you started, and then future lessons we'll look at some advanced techniques. All right, so let's go ahead and create a new scene. And I'm just going to start off with just a particle emitter, then we'll bring a collider in, okay? So first thing, like I said, bring up your effects menu system so that you can see NParticles and NCloth at the top, and make sure you're on the classic workspace so that you have access to the timeline. We're going to go ahead and change the timeline length here to 500 frames, just so we have a little more to work with. And now I'm going to come up to the NParticles window, and I'm going to come down to Create Emitter. You'll see in my outliner I now have an emitter and I have an NParticle and a nucleus. Okay, so I'm going to click on the emitter and I'm going to go ahead and just move it up in the air a little bit just so I kind of have it working from there. And my NParticles down there, I can move it up with it and put it in the same spot if we want, but it doesn't really matter. I'm just going to keep the NParticle emitters, what we're going to be working with there. So right off the bat, if I play, you'll see it's just sort of these like little dots in space, and they're spitting them out really fast. It's a shower of them. They're going straight down. They live forever. That's cool. But let's look at sort of what's happening here. So right off the bat, under my emitter panel here, you can unfold some of these panels. And first thing we have here is obviously its transform, its position, rotation, all of that stuff. Now we have different types of emitters. We have an omni one, which will emit in all directions. We have a directional emitter, which you can make it just go in one specific direction like that. Now they're all in a single line. I'm going to stop that and back it up. We have a surface emitter, which that one's not working right now, but we'll come back to that. There's curve and volume, but we'll just look at, I think, omni and directional for right now. I'm going to go back to omni. Now, right off the bat, I can decide, oh, if I don't want that many particles being made, I can slow down the rate. This is a really important one. Everyone thinks it's speed at first, but speed is really the speed at which the particle is coming out of the emitter. Rate is like how many particles per second. So what if we dial that down to 10 particles per second and back it up and play it? Now you can see I have a lot less coming out, right? Now if I combine that with slowing my speed down to maybe half of what it was, now they're, still coming out at a fast rate, but not nearly as many as there were. I could even dial this down to say like 3 particles per second and maybe a speed of 0.1 and back that up. Now you can see quite a few, just way less. I've just got a few per second they're spitting out. They're still dropping with the gravity pretty fast. Speed is still influencing a little bit, but not much, 0.01. Let's see if I can do that slow and see what kind of speed we get. They're coming out and dropping, but the gravity is really influencing it quite a bit. So let's look at gravity. So gravity is going to be under the nucleus tab. You can also just click on nucleus over in your outliner. So right now my gravity is set to 9.8, that's gravity on Earth, but what if I bring that down to 0? Let's see what happens to my emitter. Now you can see I'd have to zoom way in on it, but you can see my particles are just sort of staying in this one zone, right? And that's because the speed has been turned way down and the emission rate. So if I go back to my emitter, I can still have maybe I'll dial this up to like 14 there, and I'm going to bring the speed back up to say 0.5 with no gravity. Now we've got more of an explosion going on instead of that shower effect, right? So you can create that particle explosion that's happening there and send it off in all sorts of directions. Really fun stuff. You can set minimum and maximum distances. Even on the speed, I could randomize it by giving it like a seed of 0.7 or something like that. Now you can see I have different particles going farther than other particles because that speed has been randomized on the particles. So you can really get some, more natural dynamics going on. If I go to directional here, You obviously have different directions you want them to move in, whether it's in the X direction or the Y direction. But without gravity, they're heading out in that direction, but they're really kind of staying in one spot. But what happens if I change one of those directions and bring Y up as well? Then we're going to have at an angle going on, right? So there's a lot of fun stuff you can do there to kind of start to bring in a little bit more dynamic, a little bit of possibilities of what's happening there. I could also bring in some wind speed on this, see what that does. Now you can see they're blowing in the wind and getting randomized. They start out as a single stream, but they're kind of blowing as they go. Now that wind's up really high. And let's go back to the NParticle shape here. We could also play around with, right now it has forces with wind right now. I was one to look. I always forget where the, you can bring in like a little bit of randomness. Oh, might be under emitter here. No, the speed is random right now. We've got the X and Y. Oh, it's spread. So instead of having it come out as a single stream, I'm going to go ahead and turn that wind off again. Let's take the wind back down. So spread matters a lot. That kind of spreads out the particles instead of being in a single stream. Now we're getting that neat like spray out at that angle. And again, if I bring this back down to say Y direction down to Y, then they're only spraying out in the X. Let me bring that back and start it over. There we go. We're getting it just in the X-plane to the left and right, which is kind of cool. So spread will really increase how far those will go in either direction. And if I bring some gravity back in, if I go to my nucleus and bring my gravity back up, you can see how I can get it to kind of spray and then head downward a little bit as well, so that they start to drop in with some of that gravity. And then I come back to my NParticle here, or my emitter, and then maybe I take my speed back down a little bit, kind of slow it down. Now I'm getting like a little spraying waterfall effect, which is kind of nice, right? So it's fun to play with these dynamics. You can get a lot to happen. The other thing I like to talk about under NParticle, if we come down a little bit and we look under the shading category here, so that'll always be folded up, but come under shading here, and you can see here's where we can determine, right now it's set on points, right? So let me back this up. Let's change from points to spheres and watch what happens. Now we have spheres that are forming, right? And that's kind of fun. You get this like sphere, a little bit of a bouncing ball effect if you have it collide with something, which is really cool. And you can play around with that quite a bit. And you can also play around with the scale of those spheres. I believe that's particle size. Yeah, I can bring those down quite a bit. I could bring this down to like 0.05 and make them tiny little marbles, or I could bring that up to like 3, and now I've almost got like a clustering wall of lava going on there. So let's take that back down to 1. Actually, I'm going to take it down to like 0.3. I think that's a good size. Alright. Aside from spheres, if I come back down to shading here, we have sprites. Let's do streaks. You can get kind of a neat rain effect out of streaks. I'm going to bring the scale of that back up again. Let's bring these up. I guess the scale doesn't affect the streaks as much. Yeah, I guess that's just the streaks are what they are. There's also multi-streaks, which get kind of a neat little variation going there. You can start to see how you might create some really neat effects like sparks, or almost like a streaky rain, or different kind of particles you could get out of them. We have multi-points that you can do, which kind of vary out the different types of points. You get these kind of cluster points that happen. You can play around with, and you can see on the multi we get like different types, so you can play around with how these clusters are working and minimum radiuses and how far they're traveling. It's a big can of worms, but a fun can of worms to just kind of play with. Play around with the radius of how far these are going, point sizes. Again, there's so much to play around with in here. Same thing on the streaks. I can play around with so much. The line width, there we go. There was the line width I was looking for earlier. So, right? And beyond that, there's more in here. There's blobby surfaces, there's clouds where you can get these kind of like fun little smoke effects going on. There's other ways to do these kind of effects as well. There's tubes. Tubes are a little trickier. Not trickier, just a little bit different. And yeah, I think that went over. Oh, there's streaks, I believe, as well. I'm not sure if I did streaks, but there we go. Yeah, we did do streaks. So let's go back to the spheres. Oh, and there's also what's kind of cool is numeric. You can see kind of how the count order is going. You can actually, each one gets its own number, right? That's kind of fun. And I also like to show that way up at the top under lifespan, this is an important one to look at. Right now they're all set to live forever, but you can make them kind of die off at a constant rate, like they only have a lifespan of say 3 seconds. And then you'll see the particles start to disappear. There they go before they hit the ground. So they're like popping like little bubbles, right? Or I can say a random range, and then I can give it a lifespan but with a random, so I can make it last up to 9 seconds but with a random down to 4 seconds, and then put in a random seed, and let's see what happens. And then you get like a nice little variations of some that last and some that don't. So don't forget about that lifespan. That's a big one. All right, I'm going to put them back to live forever, and I'm going to take my shading back to spheres. And the last thing I want to show you is how to create some collisions. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in a flat plane here. Scale it up, give myself a little floor to work with. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and go to, while I have the plane selected, I'm going to go to NCloth and say create passive collider. Now you'll see there's an N rigid and there's some controls on the collision there and all of that. I can play around with bounce and friction and stickiness. But before we get there, let's go back to the N particle and let's see what happens. So right off the bat, I'm going to go ahead and play. Now you can see all those particles kind of hit it and just stick, like they're kind of like made out of glue or something. So what happens if I click on that N rigid again, and maybe I bring a little bit of bounce to this, right? And let's see what happens. And bring that back out. A little bit of bounce. You can see that just a little bit. Let's up that bounces game there a little bit and see what happens. Now we're getting a little bit more bounce happening. I could always bring this up to like 5. Now we're really bouncing. Watch out. They're really staying in a range though, right? So let's trick that back down to like a 2. Now if I go to nucleus here, I could play around with the gravity some more. Like I could bring that back up to 9.8. That part of why they're not bouncing so much is just that they are kind of hitting each other a little bit. So let's go back to the emitter here, and we've got the live forever going on. One thing I love to turn on when I start having collisions is I like to have self collide turn on. This will make the objects bounce off of each other as well as the plane. And I think we should probably go to the N rigid here and turn down that bounce just a little bit, because now that I have full gravity back, it's really going to bounce. So let's take a look again. Here we go. See, now they've got a real world dynamic. They're actually like pushing the other spheres out to the edges as they're coming in, right? And you know, I could increase this bounce even more. Now they're really bouncing off the table and bouncing into each other. I could come back to my particle here, and let's go to the N particle. Actually, sorry, I'm trying to bring up, let me stop this. My attributes won't change there until I bounce that over for a second. So we're going to go to the emitter here. Let's up the rate just a little bit, and now we'll be able to push them off the table. You'll see them come off the edge there as they continue to cluster. So that's self collide. That's a really great one to work around and to have some. And again, that was under the N particle shape, just a little bit down under collisions. You have collision strength here. It's up to 1 right now. You can play around with that, and aside from the object that's being collided, there's even more bounce for the particles themselves. You can make them bounce more as well, or you could bring in some friction and stickiness. There's so many wonderful settings in here to really create the particle system that you've been dreaming of. In future lessons, we'll talk about bringing in objects that can be turned into particles, as well as selecting objects and showing how an object can become an emitter. But this should get you started with particle emitters using the NParticles system. Have some fun, do a little trial and error and experiment, and see where it takes you. All right, thanks for tuning in.